Okay, so we just finished covering the dual brush. Let's go ahead and uncheck that for now so that we can get our precious snail back. And now we can go over to color dynamics and work on color dynamics for a moment. Let me go ahead and make a new layer and turn off this old one. So right now we've just got the snail. And also note, let me press X on the keyboard to flip the foreground and background color. We have two different colors. The green in the background is the background color and the red is the foreground color. So you can press X to flip between the two as much as you want. That will be important in a moment. Okay, so we have the, again, apply per tip. And without that, it's applying our changes to the entire stroke that you're making. If you apply per tip, then whatever changes you make will apply for each one of these little stamps that occur. And again, those stamps are controlled with the spacing option under the brush tip shape. Let's go back to color dynamics. Now we have the apply per tip. Let's see what happens if we increase the foreground background jitter. Now remember, as with most Photoshop options, if you drag on the text itself, it will allow you to drag by a certain percent. And if you hold down Shift, it will usually jump by either 5s or 10s, depending on what's going on. So we'll do a foreground background jitter. I'm just going to type, though, in this case, of 50%. Now let's watch the snail. Well, that's interesting. It seems to be changing to a duller color. What if we crank it up to 100%? Oh, that's why. It's jumping between red and green and occasionally mixing the two of them into a brown, which appeared to be a duller color. So what was going on there when it was at 50%? The changes that it was capable of making, as I keep clicking on a hidden layer, just a moment, the changes that it was capable of making were only within 25% range, or I'm sorry, I had 50% range between red and green, which in this case was a sort of brown color. At 100%, it could go all the way from the foreground color of red all the way to the background color of green. So now we get some very different colors mixing in. And that's not all. We can do the standard controls on it, including fade. So if you wanted, say, a 25 fade, just a moment, I'm going to Control A to select everything on the canvas and clear it out with delete. With the fade control set to 25, the foreground background jitter at 100%, and the apply per tip, we're going to have 25 different random tones starting at red before it goes to green, the background color. So this actually gets very interesting. If we do foreground color of 0%, we'll have a fade of 25, at which point we come to green with no randomness in the jitter. And that's just because we have a 0 jitter to it. And again, jitter is Photoshop's way of saying random. So we have a 0% random, which means that there is no change, but we have a fade. So in 25 steps, it goes from the foreground color, this red, to green, and then it sits there. So that's a lot of fun. Another great thing to do is to set it to pen pressure if you've got a stylus. So let's go ahead and test that real quick. And then depending on how light, yeah, there we go. How lightly or how heavily I press, I can get very different controls. So let me go ahead and delete that. Here I am pressing hard. Here I am pressing soft. Here I am pressing soft to hard, and then to soft again. And you can see the changes. So pressure again can be set. And remember, if you use pen pressure, you don't have to only use it once. You can use it once for every setting you want if you so desire, which will create a truly insane set of controls. But maybe it's what you need, or maybe it's what you want, in which case go for it. Whatever makes it easier for you to manipulate your brush. All right, that said, we have hue, saturation, and brightness jitter, and something called purity. We'll talk about purity last. It's a little bit different. Now, if we were to double click on our foreground color to get our color picker, we remember that while we work in red, green, and blue, that has corresponding hue, saturation, and brightness levels. So what we'll be doing is essentially jumping at different ranges of hue, saturation, and brightness if we were to adjust these switches. First thing I'm going to do, though, is to remove confusion, turn off the control so that the foreground background jitter is now at 0 with no control, which means it is non-existent. It simply does not happen. All right, so with that gone, I'm going to increase the hue jitter by 50%. Now keep in mind that we do have a hue amount. This is actually a percentage. It has to do with how color wheels work. So what it can do now is move within a 25% range on that color wheel. Let me bring up a color wheel really quickly and I'll show you what. Here we go. So we have the subtractive color wheel if we're in CMYK mode and the additive color wheel if we're in RGB mode. So the degrees that it's using has to do with a circle. There are 360 degrees in a circle. And that just means that you cut this in half and then those two halves in half and et cetera, et cetera. You keep doing that until you have 360 slices. That's just how we measure things with degrees. If you take trigonometry, you'll also learn how to do it in radians, which is usually easier to calculate for machines. But oddly, 360 is divisible by a lot of simple numbers, which is why humans figured that out. But we're less concerned with that and more concerned with what it means by percent. So let's say that we had 50% and we wanted to go 50% on it. Well, let's take a look. We're on red. If we had it up to 50%, we'll do one of three things. It will either go halfway across the circle, 50% of the circle, to cyan, covering orange, yellow, and greens, turquoise, and cyan, or we'll go the other direction, going across the pink, magenta, and violet to light blue, or we'll put the red in the middle and it will go from green to magenta. Let's find out what Photoshop does. We'll minimize this for a moment. We've got a nice red, so we'll go ahead and tell that okay. We're going to, for the sake of our experiment, set this to white as our background color, and we just have the red. We're going to do a hue jitter of 50%. And let's see what we have. We have greens and pinks and violets. And reaffirming, if we have greens and pinks and violets, my word, 50% means that it places red in the center, and then it goes 25% around the circle to the left and 25% of the circle to the right. And through that experiment, we've now unlocked a secret of Photoshop. Let's go ahead and minimize that. So if we have a hue jitter, we also have a saturation jitter. Saturation's a bit tricky to describe, but very easy to show. So if I open up our foreground color with the color picker by double clicking on it, it will open this up and it has H selected. That means that the bar on the right of this large selection square is filled with the hue. And the hue is essentially a rainbow of color. And you'll notice that at the bottom and the top, if we connected it around, it would make the color wheel that we were looking at earlier. Now, if we switch this to saturation, the bar will now be the saturation bar. Hue will now be running across the x-axis, and brightness will be running across the y-axis to create the square. We don't have to worry about that right now. What we do want to concentrate on is the fact that this bar has changed in saturation. Here's a very saturated red. Here is a desaturated red. Notice that the color is drained away, much like a popsicle that you've sucked on when you are hot and it is the last purple one and you just want all the flavor out and you don't want anyone to know that you were the one to get the last purple one and now everyone has the terrible green one. So you suck it all out and then it just looks like a piece of ice and they're like, what flavor was that? And you go, oh, totally lime, wasn't purple. So that's the same thing. We're just sucking the color out of it. And then we can just push more color into it as well by increasing the saturation. Now, using what we've learned, I'm going to press cancel. Using what we learned with how Photoshop handles the percentage and hue, we can safely assume the same for saturation. Now, this is already a fairly saturated color, so it won't be able to go as high on the saturation as it will low. And now you'll notice that the saturation, since you know what it is on the x-axis of this square. So you can see that it can go, oh, what is that, maybe 15% of this overall size of the square up. So if we set it to 15%, that will get it as bright as possible. And oh, no, that's right, it does half. So 30% will get it as bright as possible. And flipping that around, it will get it to this kind of dulled out color here. Let's see if we get that result. Going to saturation. I'm going to crank this up to 50%. We're going to take our beautiful snail. And sure enough, as predicted, we have some very intense reds, much more intense than simply the color would allow, and we have some dulled out ones. Sure enough, it is behaving as expected. That leaves brightness and purity. We'll leave purity for last. So brightness makes sense if we go back to our color picker. If we switch this to B for brightness, here's our brightness bar. While before, dragging the saturation down all of the way would result in it becoming a dull gray, moving the brightness down all the way will result in black. Pushing it all the way up will result in an extremely vibrant color, but here's what's more interesting. Pay attention to this bottom bar. It becomes pure white. That is the maximum saturation that can occur with the maximum brightness. And I can prove that by dragging this down. I'm sorry, the minimum amount of saturation that can occur with the maximum amount of brightness. I misspoke, which makes sense. If I had no brightness and no saturation, that would just be black. If I had as much brightness as possible, 100%, and no saturation, well, it wouldn't matter what hue I have. If it's desaturated, it's white. So it's a way of separating it so that we have these values of gray. Pretty neat, right? And the saturation, if we increase and decrease that, we'll simply turn that gray or white, here it is with no saturation, to a very vibrant color as controlled with the hue, which is this direction. So all of that confusing bit really means that brightness is going to mean whether or not something is pure black or just a really, really vibrant color. Let's go ahead and press cancel so we remain with our red that we initially selected. And we'll go ahead and have a brightness jitter of 50%, which we know will go up 25% and down 25%. This actually looks like a fifth and not a quarter, so that's kind of overkill. 40% should be sufficient for this. Let me move that down. Okay, and here we go. Sure enough, getting dull to very bright. If we allow for 100% brightness jitter, it could go to solid black. And we're seeing that happen right here. Looks like near black experience. If we did this long enough, we might get a darker one as it randomly distributes it. So that's the hue and the saturation and the brightness. That leaves the question as to what is purity. Purity is a sort of override. Let's go ahead and make a new layer so that we're back on where we were. Let's say that we had a saturation jitter. And let's say we had a brightness jitter as well. Getting some crazy great effects, right? Two things now combined. What if we also did purity? Now notice purity can be negative or positive. Let's crank up purity to 100%. Let's crank purity down to negative 100%. What's happening here? Doesn't this look familiar? Remember when we went to the brightness and the saturation, and we were dragging these around, and when it was fully desaturated, the brightness disappeared? Purity is essentially the saturation of the overall brush and not the colors that are being affected. So in other words, if you're concerned that the saturation jitter will cause a color that was selected to become far too bright or far too dull, you can alleviate those concerns by increasing or decreasing the purity. So let's crank up the purity and crank up the brightness and saturation to 100%. Here, let me clear this out. So 100% purity as compared to 0% purity. Notice that the 0% purity means that we can have these dulled out snails that are coming in. They do not occur here. We can get the occasional very light one, but we're not going to get these super dull ones occurring. That's because the purity is preventing that, essentially. It's pumping it back in. Over on the, let me make sure I don't get this wrong because I sometimes mix up my words. Saturation. There we go. I almost said it wrong. So if we cranked up just the saturation and ignored the brightness jitter, this will become a little more apparent. Here it is with 0% purity. Here it is with 100% up purity. Notice that it's now overriding the controls on the downward slope, but not the up. Well, actually on the upward as well because it's 100%. We did 50. then we're not going to get any dull ones, but we can still have some bright ones and less bright ones. If we went the other way, we won't have any bright ones. We'll only have these ghostly dull ones going on. All right, so that's purity. It has to do with the overall brush and not the jittered saturation that's occurring. Let me reset these for just a moment. And let's do some jitter on everything, because there's one thing that I have not done. Clear that out. Here it is with apply per tip. Here it is applied per stroke, and that's what it means to have the tip off. One click, a new click all together, yet another click, yet another click. Notice that every time I click, it's selecting a different color, but that stroke remains the same color. All right, so if I were doing Christmas light chain, I would probably do it per tip. If I wanted to just have some fun, I might do it by stroke so that I could build these up a little bit differently as I went through. So that is the color dynamics. Wow, we're almost done. That just leaves transfer and brush pose. And at that point, I can show you what the erodible, the airbrush, and the bristle brush are, and also the mixed brush, because we haven't talked about that either. But we're almost there, and then it's on to the homework. See you next video.